and the prosecutors are present as well. A couple of things before we bring the jury in. The first is I wanted to make an additional record with respect to People's Exhibit P-TR-1201 because I didn't have an opportunity to do that. I ruled in open court because the objection was made in open court. So this was the midterm paper, and the midterm paper I ruled was relevant. I continue to believe it's relevant. This is a case in which the insanity defense has been pled. It's a case in which both parties have discussed the defendant's schooling and the defendant's life in school at the University of Colorado. There's been a claim that there was a decline in defendant sometime in early 2012, perhaps the spring of 2012. And so it's relevant then to compare the before and after, if you will. And when I say the before and after, I mean his life before that time and his life after. And that includes his interactions with people, his behavior, that includes communications with people, that includes his life in general and just about every aspect of his life, and see what changes, if any, there were. So I think it's an exhibit that's relevant. It's also relevant to his intellect. I agree that just because someone is smart or very intelligent doesn't mean that the person doesn't have a mental illness. But someone's intellect and intelligence in a case in which there is an insanity defense raised may be relevant. So it's true that in being smart, being bright doesn't mean that any mental illness must be ruled out. But it's also true that that does not render the evidence irrelevant. The fact that a smart person can have a mental illness doesn't mean that intellect is completely irrelevant. I still think it is a relevant factor. It is something the experts have looked into, and that's the experts on both sides. So the exhibit was admitted for that reason. In terms of the Rule 403 objection, I don't see what the prejudice of that midterm paper is, and so the probative value of the evidence is not substantially outweighed by the danger of unfair prejudice. There's an email that it has it's sort of a cover to that paper. The email is an email from Mr. Holmes. It's a statement by the defendant, so it's not hearsay. But furthermore, the witness had already read it by the time the exhibit was admitted. So I think I didn't get a chance to mention that, and so I wanted to supplement the record with respect to that email as well. There was an objection, I think, to cumulative in terms of the emails with respect to People's Exhibit P-TR-1199, and I said, there may be slight cumulative, there may be slightly some cumulative factor here because the witness has talked about it. But, it's not improper for lawyers to ask witnesses to talk about exhibits. That happens all the time, and that is appropriate. In fact, the defense did it with respect to Exhibit P-TR-1197. That was the evaluation that the last witness did. Ms. Higgs had the witness read multiple portions of that email or talk about multiple portions of that email. So I think that just simply asking questions about an exhibit that is admitted doesn't mean that now it's cumulative and it shouldn't be admitted. So I wanted to make that record. The other thing I wanted to tell you is that with respect to juror number 557, she's indicating that she wants to talk to me. So I'm going to bring her in and see what she has to say, okay? Let's bring her in, please. The record should reflect that juror number 557 is now present in the courtroom. Good morning.
Good morning.
How are you?
I'm doing great, thanks.
Good. What's on your mind?
This should be a quick question, and I think I know the answer, but I just wanted to make sure. My mother-in-law actually has been in a nursing home, but she fell and was taken to Aurora South for hospitalization. So I just, again, wanted to make sure it was okay if I went there, because I know we're not supposed to go to certain places. So, again, just wanted to make sure that wasn't going to be a problem.
And you haven't been there yet. You're
No.
just asking whether it's okay to go there.
Yes.
And how long are you anticipating she's going to be in the hospital, or do you know yet?
I don't know.
Okay. All right, let me have you step outside for just
Okay.
a moment, okay? Thank you.
Go ahead.
Okay, the record should reflect that the juror has now exited the courtroom. That's juror 557. Is there any objection to allowing her to go to the hospital to visit her relative, Mr. Brockler? I don't see any concerns, but I wanted to make sure that I gave both an opportunity to address that. Mr. Brockler.
No objection.
Mr. King. No objection. Thank you. Let's bring her back. The record should reflect that juror number 557 is back in the courtroom. You said he was your mother-in-law?
Yes.
All right. First of all, I'm sorry to hear about your mother-in-law and being in the hospital. The answer to your question is yes, you may visit her in the hospital, and I appreciate you coming in and asking us about it. The only caveat that I would give you is that when you go there, that you don't do any investigation or any looking around or anything like that in relation to this case. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does.
So it's not a problem for you to go there to visit your mother-in-law. It would be a problem if you go there and start looking around and trying to make observations or trying to ask questions or do any research or investigation in connection with this particular case. You understand?
I understand. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much. Okay, is there anything else before I bring the jury in on behalf of the people? On behalf of the defense?
No, Judge.
All right, let's bring him in, please. Please be seated, everyone. The record should reflect that the jury is back in the courtroom now. Please call your next witness.
There are the people called Mark Delacqua.
Good morning. Could I have you raise your right hand for me, please, so that I can administer an oath? Do you solemnly swear or affirm under penalty of law that the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
Yes.
Be seated. Tell us your full name, please, and spell your first and last names once you get yourself water there.
It's Mark Louis Delacqua, Markdell, apostrophe capital ACQUA,
And how do you spell your middle name?
Louis.
All right, Mr. Brockler, you may proceed.
Thank you, Your Honor. Sir, would you tell us what you do for a living?
I'm a professor and vice chairman in the Department of Pharmacology at the University of Colorado School of Medicine.
How long have you been doing that?
I've been a faculty member at the University of Colorado School of Medicine since late 1999, so about 15 years.
We'll come back to this, but were you the principal investigator for a lab that represented the defendant's second lab rotation between 2011 and 2012?
Yes.
We'll come back to that. How do you get to be the pharmacology director, professor person?
Well, so, I was hired as an assistant professor in 1999, after my kind of training was complete, and then, worked my way up through the ranks to full professor, and then I was appointed vice chair of the department about four to 5 years ago when our new chair of the department was appointed.
You said you'd been there 15 years. Where were you prior to that?
I was a postdoctoral researcher at Oregon Health Sciences University in Portland, Oregon.
Where did you get your PhD?
My PhD was from Harvard University in Cambridge, Massachusetts.
Now, we have heard that neuroscience, the neuroscience program, is multidisciplinary, and you come from pharmacology. What's the connection?
So neuroscience program is, there's no neuroscience department at the School of Medicine. So neuroscience as a program and a discipline kind of spans multiple departments within the School of Medicine. So pharmacology as a discipline, studies interactions of drugs with biological systems, and of course the nervous system is one of those systems, and my research in particular is focused on understanding nervous system function.
You remember, in regards to that understanding did you say neurosystem function?
Nervous system function, yeah.
Nervous system function, thank you. What you were doing specifically in your lab over the period of time that the defendant had been working with you?
Yeah, so it's extensions of what my lab's been doing for many, many years. And so the focus of our research is trying to understand how connections between nerve cells in the brain, called synapses, how they're regulated by the activity of the synaptic connections to either make them stronger or weaker. And that's thought to be how the nervous system processes information to encode memory during learning. Lots of higher order function nervous system are really, when you boil it down to, how the synaptic connections between neurons are regulated. So we studied those kind of basic processes of how the synapse works as a cellular, specialized structure.
Do you have an end goal with this lab?
So we know that certainly synaptic dysfunction, when synapses don't work properly, is linked to a number of human neurological, neuropsychiatric, neurodevelopmental disorders. And so our research touches on many of those areas, but it's kind of really focused at the fundamental understandings that we really need to understand the underpinnings of how synapses work and regulated to then kind of gain insights into the dysfunction and hopefully eventually therapeutics.
And this is what you were doing between 2011 and 2012?
Yeah, it's what we're doing today too. So
I should ask you that then. Are you grant funded like Dr. Klug was? He just testified.
yes, so I have several grants from the National Institutes of Health to support my research program.
You got to be pretty protective of those monies.
Yes.
The students that you take in from the graduate program, those first year students like the defendant, are they paid out of different monies?
Yeah, the first year students are typically either paid with university funds provided by the university administration or institutional training grants, which are funded by the National Institutes of Health to specific graduate programs. And the neuroscience program is one such program which has an NIH-supported graduate training program.
Are these rotations, in essence, like the defendants in that second rotation? Are they, to some extent, auditions to see if they would fit into your lab?
Yes, in fact, I would use that very word. I think they serve two purposes. One is to allow the student to gauge whether that lab environment will be a good fit, for them, and is the scientific topic of interest, do they fit well in the lab? But it's also an audition in that the principal investigator and the lab members get to determine whether this person is likely to become a valuable, productive member of the lab.
Now, before the defendant was permitted to be in your lab for that second rotation, did you meet with him?
Yes. So
Where did you meet?
I think we met in my office. He sent me an email probably saying he was interested in doing a rotation, and we met. We talked about his interests. We would have talked about probably some potential projects, although I don't think we probably settled exactly on that project right then. That would have been more, the specific project would have been more closer to the start of the rotation, which was probably only a few weeks later.
Had you also reviewed his academic background?
Yes, so I was certainly familiar with his undergraduate performance, and test scores, and I thought that was all very good. It was still early. He hadn't completed his first rotation yet, and he hadn't had any grades for any classes in our graduate program yet, so I wouldn't have had any information so far on how well he was doing in the program, although, I had no reason to believe at that time there was any problem. So
How long was your meeting with him?
probably, 10, 15 minutes.
And look, I should have asked you this before, but do you see him sitting at the table over here to my left?
Yes.
And first off, what is he wearing, if you could?
A white shirt,
Okay, anything else?
glasses.
Okay. Does he look different to you in any way from when you dealt with him in 2011, 2012?
No, not too much.
Okay. When you met with him, did you make any impressions of him in terms of his presentation to you face to face?
No, I don't. Could you say the question again?
Yeah, his presentation to you. Did you have any impressions of him? Was he particularly gregarious or quiet or anything in between?
In general, you probably heard there's some number of people. He's quiet. He's quiet and comes off as being a bit reserved and introverted. So I would say it's probably a little more takes a little more effort to engage him in conversation and get going and kind of. But certainly that's doable. It's just he is kind of quiet.
When you engaged him in conversation in that first meeting, was he responsive to your questions and provided accurate information to you?
Yes.
So you agree to take him on. When does he start in your lab?
It would have been right around the end of November. It's typically right around Thanksgiving when the first rotation ends and the second rotation starts.
By that time, do you have a conversation with him about your expectations for him in the lab?
I tend not to be too heavy-handed. I have a little more of a hands-off approach that I really want to see what a student is likely to do on their own, kind of showing their own kind of work ethic and whether they are self-motivated. I don't want to say you have to work exactly this number of hours and and blah, blah, blah. And I realize, too, as a first-year student, they're still taking classes, so they have to balance their time spent in the classroom, doing assignments for class, doing exams with the time they spend in the lab for the rotation. So they have to figure out how to balance that, and I can't always tell them, well, then you need to work these hours, when that might not work because there's an exam, that they need to study for or something. So I usually leave it to the student to try to show me, that they're kind of up to the task. But that being said, we set forth what a project will be and what the hopes are, for the goals to be accomplished, and try to make that something that if things went well, it could be accomplished in that, 10 week or so period of time.
With the defendant in this case?
So we had a project laid out, and actually kind of almost two projects that kind of went together with two aspects, with the idea that, maybe one would work out better than the other and would also allow him to learn kind of two different sets of skills and kind of exposed to kind of two different aspects of what the lab does in terms of, the types of techniques we use in the laboratory.
Now, we've heard testimony of a lab that had 3 additional people in it. Is yours the same size?
Mine's a bit larger. It's it's currently 8 people, and I would have to say in that time period it was probably close to that size, plus or minus 1. So-
And talk to us then about over the course of that rotation, how often you would see the defendant at work in your lab or interact with him, that sort of thing.
Yeah, so the defendant did not usually seek me out. He didn't come to my office during that time. I would come into the lab, and as I do a lot of times, and check on how people were doing. And certainly if Mr. Holmes was there, I would certainly go up to him and say, how's it going? What are you working on? How's the progress? What's the next step? So I certainly had that level of interaction. One of the things that I was looking for kind of more from students is that they come and find me more often and say, hey, this is my new result, or this is where this is going. What do you think about that? So there wasn't as much of that interaction as I've had with other students, but in other ways it was similar to yet another set of students I've had in the lab that weren't as interactive.
Well, let's talk about that. You had said interactive. Can I ask you to describe his affect as well?
Yeah, like I said, he was quiet, and sometimes it was a little work to, get conversations going and get more than kind of brief answers out. So that was a characteristic. So,
Pretty flat emotionally?
yeah, in general, never I'd say inappropriately in either direction, like, and certainly never in any way angry or kind of overly animated, but yeah, in general, fairly calm and reserved.
Always polite and professional?
Yeah, certainly.
Now, you have commented on the other kinds of students that you've had in your lab that were in the defendant's position over the course of the years. Estimate for us how many people you think that is.
Probably at least 20. I'd say on average we have at least 1 rotation student year, and many years 2 or even 3. So it would probably, over that 15 years, be put somewhere around 20.
In terms of your assessment of the defendant's performance in your lab compared to those other 20 or so folks, where would you place him? Slightly below average, kind of in the bottom half, but certainly not at the very bottom. I've had, students who did much poorer job, but I've heard many that have done much better job too. In terms of his affect and his not being interactive, ultra communicative, things that you've talked about, where would you rank him over the course of those students?
Yeah, certainly also at the lower end.
But not the worst.
No, not the worst. I've had people who were more interactive but also did poor jobs as well. So I don't know that those go hand in hand. Yeah.
Your Honor, may I approach the witness with what's been marked as People's Exhibits 1196, 1203, and 1204?
Yes.
Sir, I'm handing you those 3 aforementioned exhibits. Do me a favor, take a look at each one and tell us if you recognize them, and then I'll go back through and ask you about each one individually, okay?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Do you recognize it?
Yes, yeah, I know.
Let's talk about 1196 first. Tell us what that is.
So that's a rotation lab work assessment. So it's a online form that the principal investigator of the laboratory, so the mentor, fills out at the end of the rotation to kind of give feedback and evaluation and a kind of suggested overall grade for the rotation work.
When would you have filled that out?
At the end of the rotation, including just after the post-rotation presentation.
In this case, sometime late February, is that fair?
Yeah.
Now, that presentation, or that, evaluation, we've seen a couple. Is this the red, yellow, green
Yes.
scoring
Yes.
method? Okay. And does that exhibit to you look like the complete assessment that you did on Mr. Holmes online?
Yeah, that would have been the only formal assessment I did. I think there was an option to do another one just on the rotation talk, but I didn't fill that out. I made some comments specifically about the talk just in the comment box of this one.
And we'll get there. Your Honor, I'd move for the admission of People's 1196 into evidence.
Any objection?
No objection.
Without objection, Exhibit P-TR-1196 is admitted.
Thank you. Sir, take a look at that next exhibit. I think it's People's 1203.
403 question mark?
Yes.
Okay. What is that?
Looks like a bunch of email transcripts, printouts of emails, yeah.
Have you had a chance to review those?
Yeah, I kind of looked through, in general, yeah, I know. It's basically a lot of exchanges toward the end of the rotation, would have been about the last week of the rotation, with interactions with Mr. Holmes about preparing his post-rotational seminar and kind of the final, kind of putting together his data and the analysis of that data for this seminar. So it looks like, yeah, the first one was maybe about a week, a little over a week before that, and I think they probably go up to just before the actual presentation.
Do those emails look like they have been modified or changed in any way to make them inaccurate from how they were when you remember either sending them or receiving them?
No, they look okay. I mean, I think they, yeah, it looks like what our, the emails, when you print them out from our emails, kind of system look like, so, yeah.
These emails accurately capture the communications that you had with the defendant over the period of time represented in them that weren't in person?
Yes, I think.
All right.
And I think that's characteristic that there was probably more interactions toward the end of the rotation leading up to preparing that seminar talk. And in that respect, I thought that his performance at the end of the rotation was somewhat better than it had been during the previous. He was starting to put more effort in and try to, getting this presentation together.
Kind of turned it on at the end?
Yeah, I'd say. And yeah, so.
Your Honor, I'm going to move for the admission of People's 1203 into evidence.
Any objection?
Object under Rule 401 and 403.
All right, can I see those emails, please? Here you go. Okay, for the same reasons I have stated before, yesterday and today, the objection as to Rule 401 and 403 is overruled. And so Exhibit P-TR-1203 is admitted.
Thank you, Your Honor. So I want you to take a look at that last exhibit up there that's marked People's 1204.
Mm-hmm.
Do you recognize that?
Yes. This appears to be a printout of the PowerPoint slides from the rotation presentation. I think from scanning through, this looks like it's close to the final, if not the final version of what was actually presented by Mr. Holmes on, I think it was the 23rd of February.
Is that presentation one that you had input on amending, supplementing, creating all of that with the defendant during the course of the rotation?
Yes, especially at the end, he submitted a kind of a draft of the presentation. It's in this other email record.
Stop right there so we can get it close on the record. Sorry. You've referenced 1203.
Yes, so so as part of 1203 was an attachment to an email which had kind of his draft of his presentation, which was also presented to a meeting of lab members, which included myself. And then based on feedback from that presentation and my looking it over, we had suggestions for condensing and shortening the proposal, partly to make it just fit in the time limitations the students have, because we saw that it was too much and suggested there are things you could take. And also suggested focusing on just more like half of the project that he worked on that was that gave some results you could actually talk about and maybe draw some conclusions, where some of the other experiments got some controls to work but didn't, which kind of just told us things we already knew, but we didn't learn anything new because
So yeah, so this final version was based on feedback from myself and from lab members, and kind of to come up with the final version. Yeah.
And we'll come back to the struggles that were had in the lab, but as far as 1204 goes, does that represent, does that fairly represent the defendant's willingness to incorporate some of the corrections and suggestions that you and others made into his final presentation?
Yeah. In fact, it reflects a lot, if not all of them. Yeah.
Okay. Your Honor, I'm going to move for the admission of People's 1204 into evidence.
Ms. Brady?
Objection under Rule 401 and 403.
For the same reasons that I have ruled both yesterday and today, and specifically today, to a similar PowerPoint, the objection is overruled. So the exhibit is admitted. That is Exhibit P-TR-1204.
Thank you, Your Honor. Sir, we'll come back to that. But prior to that presentation, you had talked about some experiments and controls in the lab. Would you tell us what sort of observations and concerns did you have of the defendant in the performance of the lab?
The main concerns raised by myself and brought to me also by lab members was, the defendant seemed to work well enough when he was under the direction of someone else in the lab. So he would, if he was told, okay, we're going to do this experiment, here's how you do it, took direction well, did the experiments, but then there wasn't a whole lot of feedback. Hey, I did that, all right, what's next? Or questions about, where are we going with this? Kind of those kind of things that just, he seemed to be okay when he was following someone else, but he didn't seem to be too motivated to sort of incorporate his own, kind of ideas and initiative. And so those were some of the things we're looking for, at least I'm certainly looking for when I decide to take a student in my lab, someone who seems to be more engaged and self-motivated and maybe has a knack for really catching on to what we're doing and kind of making it their own. And so that was some of the things that just didn't come out from his performance in the lab. He didn't spend as much time in the lab as many students, although I've had students who've spent about that amount of time or even less, and I've usually not been too favorable on that either. But those were the main concerns. There didn't seem to be a lot of real catching on to, really the science and working quite hard enough.
Now, given his previously described stellar credentials, great letters, great GRE scores, why isn't that automatically translating to success into your kind of a lab setting?
They don't always, because it's undergraduate education is quite different from graduate education. So students are well in kind of more structures of classes with well-defined experiments, standardized testing. Clearly are intelligent, so they do well in standardized testing. When faced with the kind of reality of how you do lab work and how you think about science and balancing that with still some component of traditional coursework, that was going on in the graduate program. Not everyone, even people who are successful as undergraduates and, are good at it, or necessarily once they do it, realize that, they might realize they don't enjoy it or don't like. So, so while, in many cases, students that look good on paper do end up being very successful, that's not true all the time.
Have you encountered stuff like that before?
Oh, yeah, definitely. So.
Did the defendant seem to fit that bill?
Yeah, I mean, without knowing why, or it's just one of those things that's wasn't uncommon, So.
Talk to us about the experiments. Did he have success in doing this experiments?
As with science in general, some things worked, some things didn't. Some things worked the first time, some things took a couple of iterations. So in the end, he did have some success on kind of one of the two areas he was working on, and that's what ended up being filtered into the kind of into the presentation. And it was a new result. So he successfully generated a few new reagents in the lab and did get some new results. So we learned some new information.
Now, prior to this final presentation, which takes place at the end of the rotation, right? Is that yes?
Yes.
You had the opportunity to sit down and work with him on his presentation?
We had some. I met with him once and helped him with showing how to analyze some of the data, hand on, kind of one-on-one. And then we also went over the presentation. We had a lot of more email exchanges, which were in whatever it is, 1203, which were about data analysis and the presentation. But we did talk in person, I believe, in the laboratory. And but a lot of the feedback kind of was also at the a result of the practice presentation he gave to the lab, and that's where I would have had more feedback, and also people in the lab would have had feedback onto how to improve the presentation, how to shorten it, to make it work in the time frame allotted, those sort of things.
You described previously that he was able to sort of turn it on at the end. How was that final presentation?
It was pretty good. I mean, like I said, it came a long way from the practice talk, because we kind of gave feedback that he incorporated to focus it and shorten it up. So in the end, I think it was a decent presentation. And I believe in the first exhibit, 1196, in my evaluation, I pointed out I thought the rotation presentation and kind of performance at the end of rotation was an improvement over kind of what I'd been seeing.
Your Honor, with the court's permission, I'd like to publish 1204 through the TVs.
Okay.
Now, if we can get this to work, at least it's a different color. Can you sort of, I don't want to go through the whole talk,
Yeah.
but to give us some sense of the presentation that he did pretty good on, that you described, would you talk us through what this presentation is about? And if you'd like, I can have Miss Amber over there, Miss Huntsman, just tab through the different slides.
Yeah, sure, I can say. So the first few slides would have been background material, basically what we already knew about the proteins we were studying in the lab, so that would have been his introductory material.
Hold on, sir. Ms. Braid.
I would like to object to Rule 401. Relevance of going through each slide.
It's been admitted, so he's asking him questions about an exhibit that has been admitted to explain some of the parts of the exhibit. So the objection's overruled.
I would object to the commentary of the exhibit.
The objection's overruled. This is no different than what Ms. Hicks was doing with respect to a different exhibit. Overruled. Go ahead.
Yeah, so these initial slides were background information on the proteins we work on the processes in the nervous system we work on, that were taken from our figures from our previous publications in the laboratory, which Mr. Holmes uses introductory material to set up the experiments he did. So these are all still background sort of information and you can see the references from our previous papers in the laboratory, and you can keep going. The details aren't important.
Get us to a place. And sir, when you see a slide that is not that introductory stuff, would you tell me so I can have you just talk just a little bit about it?
Yeah, so this is now where he would be introducing the topic of his specific rotation work. And so this is explaining the specific background for that project, which started through a collaboration with another laboratory at LSU in New Orleans. And so this is kind of specific background, but related to what he was going to do in his project rather than general background. You can keep going. And now he's talking about the experimental, this would be the experimental design, the actual experiments kind of that he did. And so these are more just the experiments.
Yes,
Yeah, I can go through more. This is some experimental data.
now, without
Yeah.
going into detail here to Charlie Horse my brain, can you give us a sense of what it was this specific presentation was trying to show had been accomplished in the lab?
Yeah, so the idea was to modify one of the signaling proteins my laboratory works out that regulates synapses, to make a specific mutation in that protein to determine whether that changed its ability to interact with other proteins at the synapse. And so that was basically, and the main approach to do that was to use fluorescence imaging, basically take pictures of cells to look at how the protein's interactions and localization change. So that's basically the data was presented. There was some, kind of preliminary findings from the rotation that manipulating this part of the protein did something.
Okay, thank you. And this presentation, sir, we've heard in the past was given to a large group?
Yeah, the post-rotational seminars, all the students, the first-year students in the program give them to the, entire program. So faculty, other students, lab members, basically, probably about 50 people, yeah.
Was this effort and this kind of rally at the last 2 weeks sufficient to impact your evaluation on a...
I'm going to object to the characterization of rally. The witness never said rally. He said there was improvement, but Mr. Brockler keeps characterizing it as a rally.
All right, I'll sustain it to the form of the question. Ask your question again.
I will, thank you, Your Honor, and forgive me for that. I think the phrase we agreed was turned on. It turned on in the last 2 weeks, is that right?
Yes, so certainly there was definitely an increase in effort and performance in the last week or two.
Was that sufficient to overcome the evaluation that you generated on 1197?
No, that still reflected that. The evaluation, it might have been even more negative if it hadn't been for kind of the improvement at the end. And my comments reflect that I did see improvement, so that was a positive, which I duly noted. But in the end, my overall recommendation, like I said, was slightly improved, but not enough that I wasn't pleased enough with the performance, and that I thought he would be a good addition to the laboratory, that it would fit well.
Let's talk a little bit through that 1197. You had made marks that would indicate red.
1196, I think.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Thank you for correcting me. And every time I've said 1197 with you, sir, I've meant 1196. Thank you. Would you talk us through what areas you expressed your most reservation and concern with on that evaluation?
Yeah, I think many of them did with, kind of lack of effort, but others had to do with, kind of I didn't think there was a whole lot of intellectual investment. I think he understood it at the level that was maybe thrown out there as a start, but he didn't delve deeper. So that some of my marks of giving lower, less positive rate, that he didn't delve into the subject matter more, with more reading, with more question asking, with more kind of thought about it. The other things were just, more reflect what I thought was not enough effort, not enough time in the lab, not quite enough investment. I gave positive marks for, I think there was interpretable data generated in the end. There was, professional behavior. There was, proper controls used, because some of that was carefully guided by other lab members, so that he learned the experiments needed to be controlled and what the controls would be. So,
did you give him a grade for his performance in your lab?
Based on the rotation work, the overall suggested grade was a B.
Now, when you say a B, put that in perspective for us. In the graduate program that you
Yeah.
participate in, how is a B reflected?
So it's a passing grade, but it's kind of the lowest passing grade. So a B minus is considered actually a non-satisfactory grade.
Now, have you given grades lower than a B before?
Yes.
Have you
So-
had conversations with students, we'll get to the defendant in a moment, where you
Yeah.
have suggested to them this may not be their career field?
Yes, I have.
Did you have a conversation with the defendant about him and your lab and his performance?
Yes, I did.
Tell us about that.
It was after the rotation talk and after this evaluation was submitted, which he would have gotten an email copy of as well. And I explained exactly kind of just what we discussed in the contents of the document, that because of those concerns, I didn't think he would be a good fit in my laboratory. And partly I explained to him my laboratory is fairly larger, as we've already established. I feel students have to be a little more self-motivated and interactive to succeed in that environment. They really need to kind of go out and get things for themselves and kind of come to me, come to people in the lab more, because it's a bigger, kind of busier environment. But I said, I think you'd be better off in a smaller laboratory with maybe a little bit more hands-on, intense one-on-one mentoring style of kind of PI, and because I think it's just maybe get lost in the shuffle of kind of my laboratory. But I thought he potentially could be successful in that sort of environment, a little bit different style laboratory. Also, the research topic in my area is fairly complex and touches a lot of things, and it's not for everyone. It's confusing, even to people in the field. It can be fairly complicated and confusing. So I also thought maybe something was a little bit, focused, kind of, and directed, and let's say more hands-on attention could be better fit.
Was it pretty clear when that meeting was over that you were not going to have him be part of your lab as part of his PhD program?
Yeah, I established that with him, and he indicated he understood.
How was his affect at that last meeting when you were discussing this?
You know, he didn't act upset, took it very calmly, and, so it was...
Over the course of the months that you saw him and dealt with him, from that first interview before you agreed to take him into your lab to this last one where you were telling him, hey, you can't join my lab, did you detect any difference in his presentation, affect, the way he talked with you?
No, I think, it was pretty constant. Like I said, there was probably more interaction at the end, just so, leading up to the presentation, so I had more chance to interact with him then than I had earlier. But the nature of those interactions weren't that different, in terms of how they went, other than there was more of it at the end.
Thank you. May I have a moment, Your Honor?
Yes.
Nothing further, Your Honor. Thank you.
Cross-examination, Ms. Brady.
Professor, good afternoon. Good morning.
Just barely.
I have just a few questions for you. Your lab for Mr. Holmes was the second in a series of 3, is that correct?
Yes.
What I'd like to do is show you a chart of labs and classes that Mr. Holmes took, and that is Defense Exhibit D-TR-8. Your Honor, if we can put that on the screen and have the professor take a look at it, please.
Yes.
And Professor, you'll see at the top there the 3 white boxes. Do those appear to you to reflect the 3 labs that Mr. Holmes took while at graduate school?
Yes.
And I think we're going to call out that middle one there. And can you let us know, does that appear to be what represents your lab?
That's not my entire lab, but that is, those are myself and 2 other people who either are or were members of my laboratory at that time.
And do you recall whether Mr. Holmes worked fairly closely with Jonathan Murphy and Emily Gibson?
Yeah, those were the 2 people he worked with most closely during his lab rotation. The kind of 2 aspects of his project, which Ms. Gibson was helping with one of them, and Mr. Murphy, now Dr. Murphy, was helping with the other one. And the project that eventually, the part of the project that was presented in the final presentation was more work he did with under Dr. Murphy's kind of with his assistance and supervision.
Okay, and it indicates that your lab went from November of 2011 to February of 2012. Is that accurate?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. We can take that down. By the time Mr. Holmes got to your lab, he had already completed 1 lab with Dr. Klug. Is that correct?
Yes.
And you stated earlier on direct that Mr. Holmes did come with a very good academic background.
Yes, at least from what I understood from, seeing grades and test scores, yes.
Okay. And you had expectations that he should be able to do the work in your lab?
Yeah, I mean, I actually, anytime I take a student in rotation, I hope that they're able to do it. I would like, people to succeed and, have good things happen.
Right, and lab work is a little bit different in that it's sort of hands-on work. Is that fair to say, more than just reading a book?
Yes.
And it's also, like you said, interacting with the other people in the lab.
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly part of it. Labs are teams, that work together and,
And so as part of that teamwork, you expect your students to occasionally approach you and ask for clarification or direction or encouragement?
Yes, and that's true of also with other people in the lab, too, for those same sort of directions. And in fact, in many cases, the lab members, other graduate students who are more senior postdoctoral researchers play as important a role in the kind of training and education as the principal investigator does.
So, for example, Mr. Murphy, who now is Dr. Murphy, Dr. Murphy and Emily Gibson, those are two examples of people Mr. Holmes should have been interacting with during the learning process at the
Yes,
lab.
yeah.
Okay. And if that does not take place, optimal learning will not occur. Is that fair?
Yeah, I mean, I think it needs to be part of the equation. Yeah, and it needs to be successful, for the student to be successful in the long run, that has to be a good fit. And there has to be interaction. No one can be an island kind of, and succeed.
And it was your impression that Mr. Holmes was not interactive enough.
Yes, and also, the amount of time spent in the lab in general was subpar.
And there's no way for you to know exactly why Mr. Holmes was not interacting as much as you expected.
No.
You found Mr. Holmes to be very shy
Yeah, in general, he was very quiet.
and more introverted than the average student.
Yes.
It was difficult for you and probably for Mr. Murphy and Ms. Gibson to know whether Mr. Holmes was learning in the lab since he was so quiet and introverted. Is that fair to say?
It was certainly a challenge, but I think at the end, whether experiments were done successfully, whether results were obtained, and whether, analysis was done properly, I think that provides evidence that things were being learned and accomplished. And I think certainly, from my interactions, especially the email exchanges which have been entered into evidence, I'm confident he did learn how to do things. He did understand, kind of what he was trying to accomplish, and was, obviously still needing to learn more. It's an iterative process. None of us ever stop learning. That's why, we're scientists. We want to keep learning. So I think progress was made, and there was learning. But in the end, I didn't think that, kind of overall it was going to be a good fit going forward.
Because you were looking for people who were saying, okay, what's next? What can we do now? Why is that?
I'm looking for students who I give A and A minuses to as the students I kind of want to take in my lab. Even a B plus performance, I'd say, that's not quite good enough. It's a major investment. This person's going to spend, usually five years or so in the laboratory. You're going to spend a lot of money on them. You really have to feel comfortable that they have what it takes, and you don't want to, not everyone's cut out for it. It's a career that takes a lot of work, a long time, and frankly doesn't pay that well, especially until you really get to be a senior kind of scientist, and even then you could have made a lot more money going into some other field, working that hard. So I think you really want to make sure the student is really cut out for it, and I think in my laboratory it takes a certain type of student to be successful. That doesn't mean that student can be successful in another laboratory, but in my laboratory, the overall outcome of the rotation made me think that it wasn't going to work.
And in those email exchanges where the slides are being shared, was that sort of a collaborative process to get, to sort of get that presentation to where it needed to be before he presented it?
Yeah, certainly the idea is, there's feedback back and forth involving me. Like I said, also there was a presentation to lab members which helped with that process as well.
So he was getting help from other people to put that presentation together?
Sure. And some of the figures that he used would have been given to him by, myself or lab members, or he copied and pasted them out of publications from the laboratory that were provided to him, with the background kind of for the project.
Okay. And your final evaluation, which is People's Exhibit 1196, the green, yellow, red evaluation?
Yeah.
So after that presentation, and you filled that out, and just refresh for the jury, green is for a good grade, right? For a good
Yes.
evaluation. Yellow is sort of concerning. Is that fair?
Yeah, it's in between. Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say it's even concerning. I would say green is something the student really definitely did well. Yellow is something they did probably an okay job with, but that doesn't mean they couldn't improve. Red means something that was, probably subpar and really could have used more improvement.
Okay. And so for Mr. Holmes on that evaluation, you gave him 9 red boxes?
Yeah, that looks about right. Maybe 4 yellows and 3 greens.
Okay. And then you also expressed concerns in the comment section about, perhaps more hands-on type lab would be better for Mr. Holmes.
Yep.
And that, on the question that said that, would you take this student into your lab for his thesis project, you checked red, I assuming indicating no.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Were there any concerns about his use of humor during presentation?
It was certainly something that characterized his presentation style. It's not the way everyone goes, but, there is some humor used in scientific presentations. And, my interpretation would be that, someone who's shy personally one-on-one, public speaking, I mean, it's a big fear for everybody. In general, it's one of those things that, when people ask what's a fear, a lot of people say public speaking is my worst fear. So I could see how using a little humor puts, the audience at ease, the speaker at ease. So, in that respect, it's not unusual, but it was characteristic of his presentations, probably I believe all 3 rotation presentations, which I did attend. But I chalked it up, maybe this is something that, it's his style, it's something that, kind of makes him feel more comfortable with the audience.
Did it come across as awkward?
I don't know about awkward, but it was a little, I guess I think he relied on it maybe more than a lot of people would, humor, so.
Despite how quiet and introverted he was he always polite?
Yes.
Did he ever cause any problems with anyone that you know of?
No, not that I know of.
Did he appear to be someone who wanted a lot of attention in your lab?
No.
In fact, quite the opposite.
If anything, it was the opposite,
Okay.
yeah.
Did you ever see him dress strangely?
No.
Did you ever see his hair any color other than brown?
No.
Your Honor, if I could have a moment?
Yes?
Thank you, Professor.
Do you have any redirect, Mr. Brockler?
No, sir, thank you.
It looks like the jury has some questions for you,
Oh,
so
okay.
give us a moment, please. Don't go away just yet.
Sure.
Thank you. Would counsel please approach? Okay, Professor, the jury has submitted some questions that, and I have found that some of them at least are appropriate under the rules of evidence and under the rules of law. So I'm going to ask those questions now. The first question is, during the time that you knew the defendant, did he ever seem disconnected from or in any way separated from reality?
No.
The next question is, describe the defendant's social personality.
I really interacted with the defendant more on a professional level. I was a supervisor, kind of not a friend. So I didn't really interact in a social way. On kind of professional interactions having to do with, the science going on in the lab, I mentioned he was quiet and, it took a little more work to communicate with him one-on-one to get conversations going. But I wouldn't know in social situations because my interactions were really more of a professional nature.
The next question is, did Mr. Holmes ever display unique or inappropriate facial and or hand gestures?
No.
The next question is, do all of the 6 or so students accepted for the first year all doing these lab rotations at the same time? Or does each student have a different rotation time or schedule? If you know. So answer it only if you know.
They are all doing them over the same 3 10-week periods in different laboratories. So at any given laboratory, there's likely to only be one student at a time in that laboratory. So Mr. Holmes was the only student in my laboratory during that 10-week block of time or so from November to February, but other students would have been doing rotations at the same time in other laboratories.
The next question is, when giving a grade for the rotation, do you consult with the other people in the lab to get their feedback?
Yes.
Any follow-up questions based on those questions, Mr. Brockler? No, Your Honor. Any follow-up questions from you, Ms. Brady? No, thank you. May this witness be released from his subpoena? You may, Your Honor. Any objection? No, sir. All right. Sir, thank you very much. Members of the jury, it's 10 after 12, so it's time for lunch. We're going to go ahead and take our lunch break. Let's take the usual 1 hour and a half, and so I'll see you back here at 1:40. Please make sure that you abide by all my admonishments during the lunch break. Enjoy the lunch. I'll see you back here in about an hour and a half. Thank you. Everyone may be seated. Is there anything we need to take up at this time from the people? Anything from the defense? Yeah.